Hey there, sexy robot. This is Two on One, the internet's top sensation, where two disciples theologians engage a theologian of the pop culture topic of his, her, or their choosing. If this is the introduction for Two on One, that must make me the Reverend Arthur Stewart.
Oh, it is the intro for Two on One, and that makes me the Reverend Stephanie Kendall.
Hi,
Hi,
Spiff. How's
hi.
it going today?
It's a good day.
It is a
It's a
good
real
day.
good day.
Should we share the news that has caused the disciples' intranet to explode with news?
Yes, our podcast is incredible, and our book has come out. Hurrah! That's what you're talking about, right?
I am. Are You Still Watching? Using pop culture to tune in, find God, and get renewed for another season is now out from Chalice Press. You can get 20% off the cover price by ordering from chalicepress.com. You can also find it at fine online retailers anywhere. What caught my eye, Spiff, not
Yeah,
my ears, but my eye, was this lovely stole you happen to be wearing. Oh, and you have it with you right now.
I do. My last Sunday at the park, as you all know, I love my park people. My last Sunday, they gave me this Jeff One Rose stole.
Lovely. It's the river of life, isn't it?
It is. It's the River of Life in Rainbow. And guess what they did?
What did they do?
They customized it for me because they know that I love a good customization option that Jeff offers. And so on the neck is our chalice.
There's a chalice.
And on the other side of it, look at that, is the Jeff One Row.
Hey,
like, there you
it
go.
doesn't say Jeff One Row. You can do better.
Oh, I like that tagline. And then on the inside, it says blessings from your family at the park. And my sermon last Sunday was about the stories that are told before us, the stories we inherit and the stories we cast, or the stories that we're a part of as we move forward together. And so to not name the people that have brought me to that moment, my park people, to bring them along both in my sermon and physically with me in this stole. It also very much felt like bringing all you deuces with us too, because we talk about Jeff One Row every week. But to be able to name everyone that has been and will be a part of my story, and the new stories we're telling together, was just a really beautiful moment, and I'm so grateful.
Marvelous. Liturgical textiles help us tell the story because proclamation is not simply sermons. To look at the full catalog of liturgical textiles, altar accessories, paraments, frontals, banners, chasubles, copes, liturgical face masks with customization options, and a variety of seasonal wear, you can go to Jeff One Row, JEFFWUNROW.com. Wait till the show is over. It's going to be a doozy today. A doozy for the deuces, but definitely head over there. Use our promo code 2on115 for 15% off your entire stole order. I do hope your friends at the park use the discount code. Not that you're not worth full price, but it's the best deal possible, isn't it?
It truly is. We've talked to Jeff. Even Jeff's own promos are less than our 2-on-1. That was the deal we made with him years ago, because he is not only our primary sponsor, but he was our very first sponsor and jumped at the opportunity when we were just a fledgling little conversation show.
Now we have the wings of published podcaster eagle.
We do, which is kind of bonkers, isn't it?
It is bonkers. We should talk more about the book, and it's going to come out soon, but I want to get to our guest today.
Because she's got a book out too.
Does have a book out too. I'm going to give her a little 30-second warning.
Perfect. Deuces, you are in for a doozies, my friends. We have on the show today Dr. Kate Ott, who I've been her student. I now am grateful to call her a friend and colleague. And she has a new book out, and she reached out, her and her publisher reached out and said, can she come on? And we were like, can she come on? Are you kidding me? Can she? Are you telling me she can? Because she's welcome here anytime.
Please, here she comes as technology works in and of itself. Dr. Kate Ott, welcome to Two on One. We are so glad you're joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
We are overly excited. I was just like, listen, I am so amped, y'all, like for this conversation, to be with you, someone that I have both had as a professor, respect immensely. I knew of your work back in my seminary days before I could ever have dreamed of calling you a friend and colleague, and just so excited. So thank you for coming on, and tell our deuces a little bit about who you are. And we hear you have a new book. So tell us a little bit about this new book and all of the things Dr. Kate Ott.
So I always introduce myself as an ethicist, and then everyone's like, yeah, okay, what else? So I am a seminary professor. I just moved from Drew Theological School to Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. And I do teach ethics for the most part, but also theology, young adults, technology, sexuality. And one of my absolute favorite things to do is to go to faith communities, talk with parents and youth about sex positive approaches, integrating their faith values to think about sexuality. And out of those conversations came a lot of questions I couldn't answer about digital technology. And so for the last couple of years, I spent time researching what most people would call sex tech. So everything from online pornography to sex robots, and thinking about how to bring that same framework of a sex positive, value-based Christian sexual ethic to those topics and conversations. And yay, out of that, we get sex tech and faith.
I like that you say that most people would call sex tech, because I was like, do most people use the word sex?
And it's actually kind of funny. My thought was any robot's a sex robot if you're creative. So
yes.
I guess.
I'm sorry, that was just an unnecessary thing.
I mean, I'm just thinking about all the robots in your house. I mean, most people's definition of robot requires movement. So that's like your vacuum cleaner and things like that. It's not necessarily the coffee pot, but it could be, because if the coffee pot's got AI and you can like preset it and give it directions, even though it doesn't have necessary movement, its components move to create something. So all of these things popped up in my head of possibilities.
Friends, that's your definition of robot, as we discuss if every robot is a sex robot, if you're creative enough. Welcome to 2 on 1.
Oh, like I said, friends, I have been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time. We also, as we are wont to do here on 2 on 1, a pop culture podcast, going to be talking about Janelle Monáe and Dirty Computer, and all the ways in which Janelle, as our kind of pop cultural touchstone, is kind of helping advance this conversation, not only just for humanity, but I think specifically there's something for us to learn through the lens of the church in that space too. And she is a part of one of your chapters on your sex robot chapter, which, you know,
virtual reality, actually.
Sorry, virtual reality. You were, my bad. I'm so sorry.
It could also have been the sex robot chapter, but it's in virtual reality.
If you're unfamiliar with Dirty Computer, check it out on YouTube. You can actually watch it for free. It's a 50-minute, it's an album. It's more than an album. It's what she refers to as an emotion picture. It's really cool. It was nominated for a Hugo Award for best science fiction, I think, film, if I remember correctly, in 2019. It's really cool. And I'm just saying this for the benefit of our listeners, our deuces. I know you know, Kate. I know you know.
Well, yeah. I think a lot of people are familiar with the album, but don't know that there's this emotion picture that goes with it. And it's more than just, say some other pop star putting together their like official videos into a single stream. It actually, it has a whole narrative that goes with it. And that narrative, even though there are not emotion pictures for the other albums she's done, and there are sort of questions about her thinking on the order of the albums, like they've come out in a chronological order, we know, but they may actually exist in a different time order than they've been released. So like Acropolis might actually be after Dirty Computer for all we know.
I love engaging like the super brilliant artists on this show. Sorry.
But before we move forward, I just want to shout out the actual name of your book, because you are here to promote a book as well. And I highly recommend everyone read it, because it's not only is it good, I have learned, you invited me into a conversation early on about it, so I've been reading it for a couple months, let's say. But it is Sex, Tech, and Faith Ethics for a Digital Age by Kate Ott. That's Kate Ott. Here we go. but it really does, our ethics are everywhere. They're a part of all the things that we do. And our sexual ethics are so prevalent in things that we don't necessarily think of as tied to our sex and sexuality. And this book really helps explore that in ways that I have found to be incredibly helpful, not only for my own personal sex ethics. We've talked on here a bit about, like, I'm a single woman, I date online and things, but like, and it's been scary and it has been beautiful in lots of different ways, but there haven't been those ethical frameworks to engage, even as I've gone through it myself. And so this book has helped not only me, but the communities that I lead. So everyone go buy it. There you go. There's your plug.
It's one of the, it is a thorough ethics read. And maybe you've read some dry ethics before. This is, you're going to, you will disagree, you will argue, and you will finish chapters and go, at least my experience of it was going, oh, damn, numerous times through the marathon reading. So.
Well, let me also, one thing I love to do both in teaching, but also in writing is to, my opinion's in there. What I think theologically, ethically is in there. But my goal is that the reader at the end of every chapter, at the end of the book, comes away with what they want their sexual ethic to be. Mm-hmm. So it's like trying to up sexual literacy and trying to up digital literacy of the reader, but not be like, this is the only way to do it. Because I actually don't think that's the right way to do ethics. But so it kind of offers, you read through and then there's questions at the end for you to think about. I might have some ideas, but what's it going to look like for you? In that regard, I got to say, I think this particular text, I really felt a responsibility to the reader to kind of try to take that perspective. So there is a lot of social commentary on like how these things are built and why they're built that way, but it's not as much background into, kind of maybe the cultural or social criticism of digital technology. I also just wanted to get the reader over the hump of like the shock factor of all the sex tech that's out there that they or their congregations might be using. So I feel like it's got that kind of like, I'm a user perhaps of these texts, and I'm reading through it to think ethically about it from my Christian perspective.
Well, and that was one of the things that I loved just right off the bat, is that I think if you asked any church writ large, just quickly, are you using any sex tech? And they would say, absolutely not. And you help them say, no, absolutely you are. Like, so let's engage it faithfully. And I thought that again, if anything, that's what I think the church really can and should use this book for, is to say, like, if you aren't thinking of it explicitly as like you are absolutely using this, then you don't have the framework to engage the ethics around it and to live into the community that you want to be or the person you want to be.
Well, it is a fascinating thing. So early on in your book, there was what made me stop and like I had to take a lap, and it's good because when I read, I stop and I take laps. Early on in the book, it was a conversation about a person who is gender diverse or figuring out what the expression of it is, and going to an LGBTQ positive campus ministry was about, well, this is how you come out and this is how you build chosen family. And I believe the question you had this person think was right, but what I really want to know is, would using a strap-on during sex make me feel like the person I think God has called me to be? And I'm paraphrasing it, but I think that's it. I think the, and I can only speak to the mainline Protestant, pretty much white hegemonic church that is actively dying. We've ceded sex. We've let go of it. We've decided it's just not a thing. It's not something to be controlled, but it's not something to be discussed, and it fails to address the whole person. And then, of course, my whole thing as a gay minister, when I introduced my husband, I've always joked that I get a whole lot of displaced misogyny in the congregation because I am shorter than he is.
Oh.
And they make assumptions, and therefore, we have our own damage. But that's as much as I'm going to talk at one time through the rest of this episode. So,
but also all implicit, right? Yes. I think, and I say this right at the beginning, that I think mainline Protestant, predominantly white congregations, which I'm part of, love to tout ourselves as sexually liberal and inclusive. And that like stops at hanging our flags or, calling ministers who are in gay partnerships. we don't actually do a whole lot of sexuality education. Now, there's that whole crop of like some congregations that do our whole lives in like UCC, UU. So more power to them. That's excellent. It's a really small fraction of that population. And then, you know, you've also got, again, in predominantly white communities, this like evangelical, you know, very right leaning, we're going to talk about sex all the time, but it's always negative, except for like this one tiny experience that very few people live into, even when they're in that marital relationship that the church says is going to be amazing and flourishing. And so, yeah, I just want us to like have a middle ground where we ask questions, where we're curious, where we bring our faith to these conversations, and we don't assume things about each other. And we definitely don't assume that the relationship we're in or our gender or sexual orientation somehow is like some magic solver to having healthy sexuality.
Yeah.
And there it is, folks.
I actually
Kate has fixed the church.
I want to bring in Janelle Monáe at this point, because I was reading up on her and about her and everything else. And what I love is she's been intentionally, I'm not going to say ambiguous, she's been intentionally disinclined to engage in regular conversation, where at one point somebody said, well, you know, who are you sexually attracted to? And she goes, androids. And her pronouns are, quote, free ass motherfucker. Also she, her, they, them. Which I think my pronouns are going to be free ass motherfucker for a while, because that's kind of lovely. But there's finding this middle ground. There's also finding like the unground. I almost want to call it the atmosphere that Janelle Monáe is in. At one point she says, remember when they said I used to look like a man, or dress like a man? And it's actually my favorite track out of the album. I appreciate the middle ground, because that's going to bring people from the right and the left together. How do we help the church also understand the middle ground is actually kind of over a chasm? Like there's some act of levitation, or do we just let people someday say, oh wait, maybe we have little work to do first?
Yeah, I guess what I meant by middle ground was not necessarily we come together across our differences, but that we get past either completely implicit messages about sexuality or completely explicit messages about sexuality, and assuming that they're always like one's always positive or negative. But yes, I totally agree with you that we need like just a completely radically different third space. And that's one of the reasons I love Janelle Monáe's work. I mean, one, she's not willing to be fit even into musical categories, which is also amazing. But she's definitely not willing to fit into gender categories. Like a lot of people, so the specific song and the section of the emotion picture that I talk about in chapter 4 about virtual reality is a riff on the Black Mirror San Junipero episode. And it's the song Make Me Feel. So also when you listen to the song, right, there's a little bit of it, you can tell, you know, there's this riff on, what's his name, Robin Thicke or whatever, and kind of like the total misogyny of Blurred Lines. That piece interesting in and of itself. So she's playing with that. She's playing with the pushback socially of coming out from a really conservative family in the San Junipero episode that she kind of rewrites in the way she participates in it. And a lot of people, both that song and Pink, people were all excited. They were like, yes, she's come out as lesbian. And then she was like, no, actually, I'm just like coming out as all these things. And you have to get used to that there's not going to be one I can be paired down to. So for me, besides the fact that it plays with this virtual reality and the idea that sexuality is so much bigger than our actual behaviors or the relationships we engage in, it's, you know, VR taps into this whole sense of sexuality as sensuality, as intimacy, that I don't have to have skin to skin contact with someone else to engage my sexuality, to engage in a sexual behavior. It does all of that in just that short period. But I think it also helps us get out of the idea that sexuality always has to be about a label, about a group that we're fighting for, or about some sort of binary dichotomy that we either have to fit into or blow up. I think Janelle Monáe's work just sort of says, look, there's a spectrum out there. And if you actually paid attention to people's lives, their behaviors, their relationships, you would recognize that spectrum. And I think from her artistic perspective, but from my theological perspective, like, that's the beauty of creation. Like, why do we keep trying to, I don't know, to deny that beauty?
Yeah.
Well, because we want to control people. I always think back to 1984. I think it's 1984, where at one point the person talking about changing language and changing perception, and at one point he goes, "We will abolish the orgasm," which, reading that book at like age 10, I was like, that's strange. But it was, first we'll abolish thought, then we'll abolish values, and then we will abolish sex. Which is always, it's a not to go too off the rails into another ethical concern, but I mean, that's part of the abortion debate in this country, is people don't want folks unlike them to have sex.
Yeah.
I mean, I know you know this. I'm sorry. Hello, world-class ethicist. I have this great baseline idea. Are you applying for
No, I mean, all of it though is like, what it's all about control too, right? Because some of it's like the fear of, the sex robots, as you had named earlier, right? Is the fact there's fear around that because robots are something, and AI is something we can't control, which is bonkers, because it shows when people are afraid of that type of thing, it shows that they think they can control other people. I mean, again, hello, world-class ethicist that we're having this conversation with.
So maybe we can come into the idea of consent, right?
Yeah.
Because the big overarching fear in Dirty Computer, of course, is that against her consent, she is being roboticized or re-roboticized, however the case may be. What is our responsibility to memory and to autonomy when it comes to the sexual ethic?
And the church, what's our responsibility? Because I think a lot of church harm and church vision come from a place of, the history that we, the trace that we carry with us from, generations past, and that sexual ethic that seemed to operate within the church so long. How do we, I guess, the question that I've been kind of wrestling with as we've all been talking is, how do we make the church okay with new sexual ethic, or just even okay with like, what's that first next step for a church to say, if you've got a throuple or a triad relationship that is consensual, adult, I'm even placing my own ethics on those things, to be really honest. I would say consent is the one that I operate and lean into most, but even when I say that's okay, what does that even mean, right? That's my own thought. But in your experience and thought, what is the next step for the church?
I think one of the initial steps for the church is just to ask itself, what is your sexual ethic? I think there's a lot of churches who don't know, or who sort of live by this, like, we have a very conservative ethic for young people, and we're going to pretend they're not sexual beings at all. And then, like, there aren't really that many young adults in the church, so we don't have to worry about them. And then, like, hopefully people will get married in some form that we recognize as like a nuclear family in the United States, right? So that makes us just all comfortable. And we can say the sexual ethic works, because we have this like past idea that somehow, as long as you get to some version of like coupled and family, it's good.
Right.
So I teach 7th and 8th grade Sunday school. And we did an exercise on like, defining your own sexual ethic. And there were a couple of parents who got a little up in arms about it. And, the pastors were like, well, we know you do this all the time. We thought it would be fine. So, well, what did you tell them? I said, well, our church's sexual ethic really that we promote about the relationships in our church and the way we talk about inclusion, everyone being welcome, is that we have certain value-based standards. Like we believe in trustworthiness, honesty, consent, mutuality. And that's what I hear from the pulpit. That's what I see evidenced in many of the relationships that we hold up in our church. I certainly don't think we have a wait to have sexual intercourse until you get married ethic, because I can name for you the number of people in the church who aren't married, and I'm pretty sure they're having sex. And the ministers literally were like, oh, yeah, I guess. And we wouldn't tell them they're wrong. And I was like, no, you wouldn't tell them they're wrong, right? Because they're trying to live into this ethic. But it was completely they just needed to look around. So I think that's the first step. Descriptively look around and say, what do we think are genuinely good ways that people are living out their sexuality? And then what might we extrapolate from that as our starting point? And that's usually values, because there's so many different relationships. There's so many different orientations and identities of people living well. And let's start there. So I think that's the first piece, because then we start cultivating a new ethic. And I actually think that's what Monáe is doing in Dirty Computer, is showing the fear we have that when people do that somehow they also gain a sense of empowerment about who they are and their worth and value in the world, right? So she's also got she's just holding up a mirror to the anti-queer, anti-Blackness of how we think about technology, but also how we think about sexuality. And by holding up that mirror, it sort of pushes back to make us ask ourselves, why do we have this ethic to begin with? And what would a new one look like that would actually allow for people to have that experience of empowerment, of self-love?
Yes. And I love, I was introduced to her in, this particular in your class, and I have held on to it so much, because I think there's something there also about what it means to be a sexual woman. And especially a sexual woman in the church. There were, as a single woman, I have been told numerous times, oh, well, we just don't want to hear about your dating life in the pulpit, and we don't want to hear about, and I was like, when have I ever? That's not what I'm preaching on. I'm sorry that that's a concern of yours, but it is
smoking hot wife.
What?
And yet we have the phrase smoking hot wife that has entered the evangelical lexicon. Pardon my interruption, Spiff. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. But yes, that's the thing, right? Because we are also performative in our functions in the church. And we being self-identifying women, especially those of us that are called into leadership in those spaces, whether the leadership is explicit or not, because that's a whole other piece of who's allowed to be sexual. As the pastor, I am generally not allowed to be, and that is, it is what it is. It's how we work forward together. And I think why part of my question is where do we start? Because I think for me, I've always said, the start is to know your own sexuality, know who you are, because so often we have used the framework of the church or society to tell us who we are. So what does it mean to take that label off? I'm grateful to have actually grown up outside of the church for the purpose of knowing who I am before I came into the church, and as a church leader. And so I can say, no, here's my wholeness. I never had to fight anyone, saying oh, well, gay people are choosing this thing. I don't identify in that way, but I just know people and have been around people enough in my life to know, no, these are just people. This is just who they are. And to know that truth and then bring that fullness, because I think, again, exactly what you said, to name what the church's then sexual ethic is around it. Because I preach, bring your whole self to the church. And I mean it when I say that. And as I lead a church, I hope to help them understand that they mean it too, or I hope for them to mean it, because I think in their hearts, they want to mean it. And in their minds, they don't know how to mean it yet. And especially now then when we add tech into it, because tech isn't going away. And I don't know the percentages out there, but the amount of people meeting their spouses, their partners, their hookup partners, their consensual sexual adult partners through some sort of sex tech is probably astronomical and way more than any of us want to imagine. But also, I want to say there's probably a generation of us that were only taught, or at least early on taught, watch out for the sexual the only people who are using sex tech are sexual predators. As a young woman in the early 90s, when it was like AIM and it was like, chat rooms where it was like age and whatever, and you could be like, I'm 34 and whatever, and you're like, I know, I'm 12 and just trying to figure out life as a digital person. So
I just want to point out the same people who cautioned us to be so careful and so meticulous about scrutiny in the 90s are now the people who share from freedomeagle.facebook that, the COVID vaccines are actually microchips that are supposed to make us sterile so Obama can force healthcare on us. I don't know. I don't read my uncle's email forwards.
Yeah. I mean, I also so let's debunk a couple of things.
Yeah.
The first is that this ethic is somehow like just a free for all.
Yeah.
So, it could be adults, but usually I'm working with teenagers and young adults, and they're all excited because they think I'm going to get to the end of this and be like, yeah, you can do whatever you want. And then we get to the end and I'm like, okay, so, you got to live up to this ethic for it to really embody your Christian values, right? Are your relationships honest, consensual, mutual? Are you really showing a connection with God? Are you, being just towards each other? And I always sort of pause. Okay, so which one do you think is harder? Getting married or doing all of this? There's always absolute silence. And, some brave person always raised their hand. They're like, oh.
Oh.
Yeah, it's really hard to do all those other things. That takes a lot of work. So I think the ethic that I'm promoting is more difficult than our sort of you just need this mix of things.
Right.
In your marry this right person, or have the long-term commitment, or don't touch anyone else. I think actually living into those values is tough for us in all of our relationships, but especially in our intimate ones. The other piece, all of the research demonstrates that if you are a religious leader and you do the work, the hard work of looking into your sexual attitudes, values, and history, that it makes you less likely to abuse, to wander, to step over a boundary and harm someone else. But we work with this myth in the church that somehow if we don't think about sexuality, or if you're in a heterosexual relationship, if you just bring the other gender person into the room, somehow you won't cause problems. So yes, right. There's actual good data and research out there that teaches us these things.
It's fascinating that it's the most obvious step. We just need to discuss it and examine it and name it.
It's doing your own work though. I mean, right? How often it's why we get continuing ed things. What does it look like to use your continuing ed to, even if you have been married for 40 years, to examine your sexuality, your sexual ethic, who you are and who you want to be
especially if you've been married for 40 years.
Or especially,
you might really need it at that point.
No joke. And, in the same way that I hope that we're doing that around race, around all of the other parts of who we are as faith leaders, and I love that you named that. If you're doing the work internally, you're less likely, just the research shows, to harm others. I have always said that I was kind of fascinated that when I took my ordination oaths, that it doesn't start with kind of in the same way the Hippocratic oath of to first do no harm, because the church harm is kind of the social narrative that we are all just daily running up against, and it's what's keeping young people out of church. It's what's keeping people from bringing their whole selves to the communities and all of that. And so I'm always just no, let's talk about it. Let's do these things and move forward, because if we're not, then the harm is going to come. And I'd rather play offense than defense in this space. So
I just always think about three things with sex and tech and church and such. The first is, these two kids who I loved when I was a youth minister in the North Texas area. That's Spiff and I met doing summer camp, technically. They had a sexual relationship, and the girl became pregnant. and I think they had just graduated high school. They were in their senior year of high school, and they were made to go in front of the church to, quote, confess their sin. So if that doesn't like ruin one's relationship to their unborn child at that point, I don't know what it does. I actually mailed a bunch of red A's for the girl to wear to the church because I was furious when I found out about it. The second thing was a friend of mine who was a called pastor in the 21st century was cohabitating with her fiance, and she had to explain to the church that this was happening. Rent is so damn high where she lives, it makes no sense to live separately. And also, it's not 1954, and this is not an episode of Leave It to Beaver. They did sleep in twin beds, though. I'm kidding. And the third one, of course, is right. Dealing with we do in the Disciples in some regions. There's Created to Be Me camp, or it used to be called Aiders, and I forget what it is in there. It's a work in progress, which I will always appreciate. The camp is infinitely better than it was 15 years ago, the first time I encountered it. And yet there are so many aspects of just don't do this. So maybe I need to send your book to the board members and say, so when we talk about pornography, can we pretend like it's not unavoidable, or wait, that it's not avoidable? I forgive me.
It shouldn't be avoidable.
Right. Like, can we pretend like people have?
Right. Or could we teach young people, could we teach everyone how to discern what kind of sexually explicit material is going to be helpful and empowering to them, and what kind of sexually explicit material is going to be disempowering, racist, sexist, and how to like leave one behind, but be okay with the other use?
Exactly.
I mean, that's incredible. And that's, I think, part of what I love about your book is that I could envision, and about what Janelle Monáe's work does, is that it puts visually all of this curiosity in front of you, because we'll talk it to death, right? We'll talk it until we are done and we feel really good about all of the conversations we've had. But if you can't stare at the video for Pink, seeing explicitly what it's trying to show you, without being uncomfortable or, set aside, and not seeing it as a piece of, a holy space of, of the female body, or of, I don't want to say female, all of it. Like, what does it look like of bodies in general? But your book, again, brings so much to the forefront in both my mind to be able to like think about these things in real tangible ways, because I think also part of what the church needs to get out of doing is talking itself to death until it, I want those conversations to die, to resurrect into actionable items, to say, here is what it looks like, here's what it feels like, smells like, tastes, all of this, like in the wholeness of who we are called to be, and to engage it in a kind of 5 cents way.
And that's part of, one of the reasons I tell the stories in the book, or, use pop culture, use Black Mirror, use Janelle Monáe's work, is, obviously from Marcella Althouse Reed's work on sexual theologies and sexual storytelling. But, I agree. Sexual stories make our theology for us. And so even the 3 kind of examples you just gave us, think about those young kids who, 50% of pregnancies are unplanned. Now, most of them are in situations with adults who, have resources. Many don't, but a lot do have resources, can make decisions. Who knows how that will change now that access to reproductive health care is being severely limited. But if 50% of pregnancies are unintended, that's across the board. It doesn't matter how old you are. First, I want to say we have a problem with sex education if 50% of pregnancies are unintended. Like, we should get on board with how that happens and be able to plan a little better from my perspective. But that also means that we're picking this one group, right? These teenagers who we need to shame. And so I also don't want to, leave your Deuces thinking, oh, all sex tech is great. That's not what I'm saying either, right? Like, technology has downsides. And one of the major downsides I think sex tech has is that it continues to further privatize how we think about our sexuality. Ooh. And, one of the things the church has done is like make sexuality a political and public issue, not in the way I would like them to, but it has. And I'm worried that the more that we privatize our understandings, our experiences, our relationships around sexuality, the fewer and fewer ways we have for community to be part of those expressions. And for example, those kids being put up on the altar, to be totally ruining their relationship with God, but with their community, who's there to support them, right? Like that's actually what I want, is our churches to come together and be supportive networks for each other.
And it's always we had a polyamorous family at a congregation I served. And my rule with church is this: here is water. What stops me from being baptized? I do not believe there is a purity test to participate in the church. Not that there should have been from this marvelous family either. And one of my little old ladies was very traditional at, this wild leftist church that I served. She said, I don't know what to do about this. And I said, love them, like make conversation, just like avoid the stuff you don't know how to name. Ask questions. Don't. It's curiosity, not judgment, is what I could have said if I would have watched Ted Lasso and talked to Spiff years and years before.
There's a chapter in a book that has just come out that
called "Are You Still Watching? Using Stuff to Do Things." But it is that. I mean, what if community doesn't have to have answers? What if community doesn't even have to have questions? What if community just gets to be and become?
That, and what if we trust our scriptures and the holy words that we form our relationship to God through and from as strong enough to withhold our curiosity towards it? What if we talk about Mary having an unplanned pregnancy, an unconsensual pregnancy, and a community that both supported, a spouse that was supportive, things like that, and given her, she did not have the autonomy of her body to say no necessarily, or maybe she did, I don't know, but how to engage those conversations faithfully, the story of Lot, the story of Jezebel, all of these things that we have used to build a sexual ethic that does, in my opinion, more harm than good for God's kingdom as we move forward, especially in new spaces. How do we utilize ancient texts for, new vision, and especially around sex? Because if we're saying that we have not, Arthur has something to say. I can. I know, but it's one of those things. If we can't name that we're already using it to inform who we are, then we can't move forward and use it to name who we are becoming. And I think that that's the gift of scripture and a God that's still speaking, is that we should be using it that way.
I can't help but bring this up. For a few years, I've been thoroughly studying the Pauline letters, particularly 1st and now 2nd Corinthians. I'm almost done. No spoilers. We are a spoiler show, but not for 2 Corinthians 13. They in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul's sexual ethic literally is, who cares? The end of the world is coming. Please start caring for your neighbor, or rather stay as you are. And so then my question becomes, does the church's ethic change to a more inclusive dynamic if we become more apocalyptic? Or is eschatology perhaps what is missing? Can we help people move past stuff into I don't care, not as I dismiss it, but rather it's no longer a problem if we say, like, the world's going to end tomorrow?
Well, I mean, that from my perspective is the premise of Dirty Computer, right?
Yes.
Like the world is ending and it is dystopic, and there are, all the regular things about the world are gone, and they are this group that's sort of hiding out from the surveillance state that's trying to push everyone into one way of being.
I love the answers in the trunk of the floating ancient convertible. It was just a beautiful moment.
Yeah. And so maybe if we get there, I do think a lot of people talk, especially about technology, with that dystopic kind of apocalyptic feature. One of the things I've been trying to do is we theologize about technology. And obviously this is kind of following, in a lot of the Donna Haraway kind of feminist footprints around digital technology, which I think Monáe is playing with as well. And that's why there's like this cyborg arch android figure as opposed to a transhuman. She's like pushing back against this enlightenment. We will move beyond how we think of humanity, and instead is really playing with this notion that we have always been some form of technology, of nature, of humanity. Like it doesn't have these false boundaries that we have tried to create for centuries. Instead, we are actually that mix, right? We are dirt and computer, dirty computer as the human that's being seen. And she completely refigures our notion of, of sort of a second coming of a Christ as we think eschatologically in dirty computer.
Jim Crow Jesus rose again.
Oh. This is also good. And I'm like I'm like, ooh, is that where I go for next Ash Wednesday? Is that we are dirt and tech, like we are dirt and technology moving forward, especially for churches who are now leaning faithfully into being both a digital, an online community and an in-person community, and how as pastors or faith leaders, we can faithfully engage both in their fullness and in their wholeness. Like one of those questions I think the church isn't asking enough is like, how are you, like, are the people who are strictly online community members, how are you making sure that they are being fed spiritually from home? I think for so long, our homebound members who didn't have access to watching a worship online, who just maybe had a deacon come by with communion, but it's not necessarily the largest of community that they were baptized into. We now have a new responsibility because once you know better, you can do better, right? I'm not trying to point fingers and say everyone was terrible forever and ever. It's like, no, but we just know better now. And now we know you can bring the fullness of beloved community to people who are, for whatever reason. It's not just homebound people anymore. It's just for whatever reason. Have you created a safe space for them to come into or a brave space for them to come into and be loved? I don't know. So maybe that's their own ethic of their personal safety, is they're just going to be a digital congregant. And that's no more or less valid reason to explore your faith and be in community. And how do we do that now from their own, fullness in their embodiment? Like again, what I think the chapter that I really, I've read I think 4 times at this point, is just like, what does it mean to be outside of your body? Like, how do we be embodied people in a tech space is the real next question for the church, if we could even figure out how to be embodied people in an embodied space faithfully. But that next question, because again, that's where we are. And so to ignore it only goes against that, or promotes the harm that we have been perpetuating for years.
That piece of being embodied with tech, I think, is the hardest for us to wrap our minds around at this point. And a lot of the tech is shifting quickly, right? Especially with virtual reality and sort of multi-sensory engagement. Mm-hmm. But there's actually a step before that. Yes, I think our experiences in something like virtual reality are embodied. They are embodied because of the interface of the human hardware software that happens. So I could take on a different embodiment, and research shows us that, if I were like cis heterosexual male and I go into a VR experience where, I'm embodied female or smaller, all these kinds of things that shift the power dynamic of my gendered appearance, and I experience certain kinds of either, potential violence or name calling, that I literally feel that affectively in my offline body in a way that starts to change my perceptions of stereotypes and discrimination. Mm. So there's definitely a connection there, even if we're only looking at the embodiment that happens in something like VR. But I really think and this is coming from theologian Cutter Calloway, who talks about the interface being the moment of connection, that I don't think we've ever had a theology, if we think about Paul's letters to Corinthians on the body of Christ, I don't think we've ever had a theology that stops at our skin. I think it almost starts at our skin. So our skin might be an enclosure that we have to keep my organs and blood and nerves in. But who I am in the world, who God created me to be, is about this relationship that happens at interfaces. And that might be human to human. It might be human to nature, human to non-human animals. It might also be human to my phone. Like when I touch that phone, I am connected to others. I am creating a sense of identity that is beyond the bounds of my skin. But I also think it connects us, and this is like the meta-ethical part, is like, who are the people who dug up those minerals, the blood and sweat that goes into putting it together? Like, can we pick up a device and actually know the interface that is connecting us to globally, earthwise, all of those pieces? So that takes us a little further than we were going, but I really think that's the place where, if we think about the body of Christ, we've now included a digital interface to how that functions in the world.
What does it look like then to pray? Sorry, you just like in my head, like, right. We do like prayers at the table, and we thank the farmers that grew, and, you know, the transporters who brought, and the cooks that made. But like, what does it look like then, especially coming, you know, we're still in COVID era life, but like early COVID, where like I talked about, you know, I didn't leave my home for 6 months, not once in early COVID New York. So the only thing that kept me connected, and I live alone, that connected me to other people was my phone, my niece. But like, what does that look like? And so now what does it look like to give a prayer of thanksgiving for the connection that is right here, but also for those that dug the minerals, those that, you know, made the computer chip, those that put it together. And, you know, it's an entire community of God's faithfulness that led us to this. And we want to call it bad. I think that feels really unfaithful as well.
So then, even taking it a step further in it, because I've never heard anybody describe themselves as the skin when we talk about the metaphor of the body of Christ. And that's going to ruin, thank you, Kate, you've ruined that's ruined my day. But there's also our deep friend, Dr. Namsoon Kong, always says, "I'm not I until you are you."
I love you, Dr. Kong.
Yeah. Spiff loves you, Dr. Kong. I also appreciate you. I just don't have the depth of that relationship, but what if there's not necessarily an individual in the way that we insist there is? Not that libertarian nonsense of I'm a house cat, but truly, like, we cannot exist alone. We don't exist alone. We won't exist alone. I don't know. I had a question in there, but my brain melted.
Well, that also, I mean, part of what I'm also trying to say when we think of VR or sex robots or even pornography is that even if that other thing that I'm engaging in, this sort of very libertarian, autonomous, I am an individual who, you know, is independent, and this other thing doesn't count, right? Because it's a machine, or it's a software conglomeration of pixels, or it's perhaps real, perhaps not. We don't know. It's a pornographic show, and maybe those people were real, maybe not. I just want to say, I don't care if they're real or not in your definition of real. How I engage them, how that relationality happens, impacts who I am morally and impacts how I show up. And that means it's not me as an independent bubble. It's always me in relationship, and how that relationship is never singular or one directional.
Yes.
Yep. I'm sorry. Okay. So we get to have our own morals and ethics, but we are ultimately communal. I like that.
And communal, so beyond, you know, in our skin and beyond. That even, and I think now I'm thinking, like, right, I just bought this phone. It's also called a skin. And so, like, the skin of our phones, the skin of our people, you know, our personhood being so connected both physically and digitally to create God's kingdom writ large and move us forward. It's so good.
There's also like a whole nother episode on how we politicize skin, right? As we think about how we racialize and gender and embody, you know, ableist kind of things, and how we think of the way skin should be and what counts as the best one. There's I think N.K. Jemisin.
Yeah.
So I love sci-fi writing. Obviously, you'll get that if you read the book. She has this absolutely amazing short story called Skin. Anyway, no spoilers on that. Just, I think it's actually on Amazon.
All of N.K. Jemisin's short stories are also available, I believe, through her website, because I also am a big fan. The City We Became is so good.
As a New Yorker, obviously.
Yeah, and next time you come on 211, we can do that too.
If you're not
but-
reading Afrofuturism as part of your fiction diet or reading diet, you really ought to. N.K. Jemisin, literally anything she writes. Octavia Butler. Actually, yeah, just read something by them and let us know you have. Send us pictures.
Yeah, and we will name, just for, because I don't know that we named it explicitly up top. We are three white people from mainline traditions and things. We're speaking from a very singular narrative of all our own experiences, but in this collective conversation, this is not the only conversation to be having on sex tech, on digital tech, on church ethics. It is. We'll just name it that's the lens in which we are engaging this conversation. So, well, I think we've hit this mark. I could talk to you forever. This is the most fun. Like I said, I've been looking forward to it all day long, all week long, and longer than that. We've been talking about this for quite some time. But thank you for coming on. Thank you for being a part. As is our tradition, we have one final question, and you will get to answer first. But what is the biblical narrative, theme, verse, person, whatever, that you are most reminded of in Janelle Monáe's Dirty Computer?
Oh, the Syrophoenician Canaanite woman. To me, that story is the moment where, like, we actually get, from my perspective, we get a female Christ that's trying to make the embodied male Christ be what he's supposed to be for our world. She's the only person that bests him in an argument. And it's the moment where he also, I would say, back to a lot of our sexual ethics, Jesus is, a great model for saying, I don't know, or let me just welcome you and you live this out and figure it out. And I want to model that, but I really also want to model the Syrophoenician Canaanite woman who says, and even you, Jesus, might get it wrong sometimes. So how do we move beyond that? And I think Janelle Monáe is living into that embodiment in Dirty Computer.
Oh, amen.
I just preached on the Syrophoenician woman, and what stood out to me on that was Jesus was entirely alone when this happened. And therefore, the only person who could have told on Jesus was Jesus. And therefore, he went back and said, guys, guess what I messed up? Like,
I love that.
Yeah, like, my story, or my story theme, whatever, is Abraham and Sarah. When the angels inform Abraham that Sarah is going to become pregnant, and she laughs and she says, I'm supposed to have pleasure in sex at my age. And the NRSV just takes all of the snark out of it. And every Advent, when it comes up or whenever the story comes up, it's so necessary to say, yes, people actually wanted to enjoy sex from time immemorial. And sometimes people didn't enjoy sex from time immemorial. Because we act like, well, again, the sexual ethic in modern day Christianity is kind of bonkers. Spiff?
I'm going to go where I think everyone thought it. Well, our Deuces are probably thinking I'm going with this. I'm going to go with Revelations Jezebel.
Revelation Jezebel. Her answer's Revelation Jezebel.
Absolutely. Because I think that that's a place in which we place the sexual ethic of community onto a woman who continues to do the work of theology outside of our understanding of it. She continues to preach. The whole reason he's like, and you continue to listen to this woman, Jezebel, is because she continues to do her work regardless of the ethics and of life that we have put on her. And yet then her sexuality becomes the thing that is the punishment for everyone, right? He disagrees. Jonathan Patmos disagrees with her theological understanding, the work that she is doing. And instead of saying you need to be closer to God or whatever in the way that he does with other men, he's like, I'm going to rape and kill your children. And that's the way women are seen often. And yet she keeps going. And Janelle, anytime we try and place her into an ethic or a box or whatever we are doing with her socially, she continues to disrupt that and move forward. It's one of those nevertheless she preached moments that Janelle keeps preaching, Jezebel keeps preaching, and so does God.
She's a free ass motherfucker.
Yes.
Okay, this has been 2-on-1 Deuces. I hope you have your bingo card out because you not only got Revelations Jezebel, you also got a Corinthians reference and a promo for our book, Are You Still Watching? Using Pop Culture to Tune In, Find God, and Get Renewed for Another Season. And another thing to add to your reading list, Sex, Tech, and Faith Ethics for a Digital Age by Kate Ott, our marvelous guest. And we are sponsored by Jeff Wonrow Design, celebrating 17 years of making ordinary time extraordinary. You get a full field bingo card today. Check out jeffwonrow.com and use our promo code 2on115 for 15% off your entire Stole order. On behalf of the 2-on-1 Project and Dr. Ott, we're going to ask you to close us out with this introduction type thing. I'm your co-host, the Reverend Arthur Stewart.
I'm the Reverend Stephanie Kendall.
And I'm Kate Ott, an ethicist.
Hey. Deuces, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Get more 2-on-1 at 2on1project.com.